And joining us now on the debate, in Montreal, Quebec, Joseph Orosz, Hungarian journalist, now living in Canada. And joining us here in studio, Gina Chani, board chair of the Roma Community Centre in Toronto, Randall Hansen, professor of political science at the University of Toronto, and we welcome back Anna Porter, author of The Ghosts of Europe. I want to thank everybody for coming in today. Joseph, nice to meet you on the line in Montreal. I want to start because this is a community. Yes, it's lovely to have you with us. Let's put up a map here, Michael Smith, if we can, because the Roma are a community, certainly here in Canada, but overseas that we may not know that much about. Let's see where they live. There are more than 1 million Roma living in both Romania and Turkey, Hungary, Bulgaria, Serbia, Russia, Spain, all have Roma populations in the hundreds of thousands. France and Germany and Great Britain each have Roma populations between 100 and 500,000. Total number of Roma in Europe estimated at 9.8 million. You will also hear the Roma referred to as Romani, gypsies, travelers, or tinkers, and we'll talk about that during the course of our program. Randall, I want to go to you first because I guess one of the reasons we're doing this program tonight is that the Roma have been much in the news in the last couple of months, particularly in France, where they have become persona non grata. Can you fill us in on how that has happened?
Yeah, absolutely. Very briefly, France, under direct orders of Sarkozy, this was his policy, took a decision to clear illegal Roma settlement camps outside the major cities and began expelling them in the hundreds. Now, France has been expelling Roma for years. About 10,000 were expelled last year. What's different this time is that Sarkozy made it political issue number one.
Why are they being expelled?
Well, there's two sets of reasons. The reasons of political opportunism center in the fact that Sarkozy thinks he can gain some votes by cracking down on the Roma. Otherwise, they're being expelled. Well, firstly, because they're not terribly popular. Again, that's a political reason, but there's also real problems with the Roma, problems of poverty, problems of unemployment, problems of criminality, and problems of illegal settlements. So
Joseph, let me get you to follow up on that. Why do you think the French authorities are now targeting the Roma?
Steve, who are the Roma? You wouldn't even believe what a hard questions you have asked, although it sounded very simple just for the records. I should tell that the Romas are human beings. I find it important to say, because in the former Soviet countries, Romas have been frequently considered not as human beings, but parasites or a kind of living creatures born to be criminal. So you mentioned the numbers of the Romas all around in the continent. Can any of you imagine such a number as if a double-sized Toronto lived in poverty, lived in despair, and was being discriminated against only for the color of their skin, for their extraordinary culture, and for their unusual habit? I know it's hard to imagine that a king-size Toronto would live in an ethnic ghetto, in an ethnic gap, but not among skyscrapers, but in shanty towns. So historical records show the Romas came from India, northern India, between the 9th and 14th century. And the symbiosis between Roma and old Europeans produced lots of ups and downs in the history.
Let me stop you there for a second, Joseph.
Roma
stand by, Joseph.
In the Second World War. But Steve, let me tell you, I cannot mention any kind of ups in the history of Romas in Europe.
Yeah, that seems like a good place to go to Gina, because why do you think that your community is being targeted as it has been in France over the last few months?
Well, I think that this is actually nothing new. It's just receiving a lot wider media attention than it has before in the past. The legacy of Roma in Europe since the diaspora began approximately 1,000 years ago has been a legacy of expulsions. It has been a legacy of forced evictions. It's been a legacy of being treated as subhuman people. And What's happening in France right now is just a continuation of that. This legacy of expulsions led to the stereotype of Roma being these nomadic people that are incapable of settling down. It's always been having to move on to find safety, to find a life where they could live in peace.
You say it's a stereotype, meaning you don't believe it to be true.
There are Roma that do live a life of being a little bit more migratory, and that often has a lot to do with reasons of job, occupation, of what they're doing. If they're horse traders or some of the more traditional trades, but more or less the vast majority of Roma have been where they've been in certain European countries now for hundreds of years. And they're not, it's a stereotype. The nomadism is definitely a stereotype.
Let me get Anna Porter on this, because you, in your travels to write your book, encountered Roma, no doubt, and talked to people about them. What did you learn?
I've also talked to a lot of Roma. I mean, one of the things I question about what's been happening in France, and it's just it's a curious thing that a number of French intellectuals are characterizing the Roma as natural travelers, that they really like a peripatetic lifestyle. They actually like to move around.
Nomadic.
They're nomadic, and given that there is free travel in Europe, there's no reason why they should not be allowed to travel freely wherever they wish to be. Now, on the other hand, the Roma I met in Hungary, in the Czech Republic, and in Slovakia have been settled where they are for quite a long time. So,
meaning decades or hundreds of years?
Well, in the case of the Roma leader in Prague, who is he runs the Roma Center in Prague, and his family have been there since the 16th century. His family came in. Actually, they were soldiers.
That doesn't sound very
for the
nomadic.
Habsburgs, not in the very slightest. Yeah. And proudly displayed in his office in downtown Prague is our decorations received by his great-great-great-great-grandpa in service of the Habsburg Empire. So they've settled and they're happy. His view was that even though things are pretty dismal in parts of the Czech Republic, and they are dismal. I mean, they're in some parts, they're unbelievably bad. It's still better than in Romania, for example.
Okay, Gina, follow up if you would.
Can I just add to that, Anna, is that in the Czech Republic, they've actually built a wall, a concrete wall around some Roma settlements, which can be comparable.
The government has?
Pardon me?
The government has built this wall?
Well, local people have built the wall.
The local government has built a wall around the Roma settlements.
Yes.
Yes.
Joseph, you wanted to say?
Sure, I just would like to say, instead of adaptation and peaceful coexistence during hundreds of years of symbiosis, the majority of the society has always made problems for Romas, and the minority, Romas, have always made problems for the majority of the society. Consequently, the whole society has got into mousetrap so far, from the Black Sea to the Atlantic Ocean. That's the general view in Europe.
Randall Hansen?
Yeah, I just want to come in on that, because it seems to me we're creating this picture of these perfectly wonderful, innocent Roma and these awful, nasty, racist Europeans. And on any topic, this sort of narrative strikes me as a little bit simplistic. And I'll just give one example. When I was watching the BBC, they interviewed some young Roma who said on camera about the expulsions, this is like Hitler, this is ethnic cleansing, and then off camera said, well, we prefer it here because petty crime in France is punished less severely than Roma. Now, I have no idea how representative that is, but I'd put it to our guests. That's clearly in the picture somehow. Okay,
Gina, you know, this is part of the stereotype we hear, is that petty crime is a part of the Roma existence. Would you speak to that?
Well, what I would like to say is that the Roma have been almost completely marginalized from the employment workforce in most European countries, especially in East European countries. In Hungary alone, there's an 85% unemployment rate for Roma people there. And a lot of that is due to the fact that they're just Roma. They're able to be marginalized based just on this ethnicity and excluded from the workforce. So for generations and generations and centuries of not being able to obtain employment, people have had to survive on other means, unfortunately, but that can't characterize an entire community. And by bringing that up, the fact that, you know, some youths were mentioning petty crime, I mean, youths from any culture could potentially mention petty crime. The problem with Roma is that it actually becomes inherently attributable to Roma, that for some reason it's in the genetic makeup to rely on crimes as a means of existence.
I don't think he said it was part of the genetic
No, I didn't
makeup.
mean for, in general, you saying that, but that's a common belief, a common belief of inherent deviance.
Anna Porter.
Well, one of the things that was mentioned by both the Roma leaders in the Czech Republic and in Hungary was that the employment issue didn't seem to be as great under the communist regime, largely because there was a fair amount of labor available in factories and on farms for Roma, and this, with the change 20 years ago, has all but disappeared. So they can't find work. And worse than that, their children, the educational system is really set against their children. And one of the wonderful things about, I just throw this in, but about the help that some organizations are able to provide or have been providing, like George Soros' Open Society Fund. I don't know whether you followed, but $150 million has gone some way to provide educational incentives and education itself. Because one of the things that's happening in a lot of these places is that Roma children are placed in institutions for the mentally retarded. This is where they're doing their studies. And the chances of their becoming future leaders or trying to help their people get out of the mess they're in.
Impossible in those settings.
Impossible.
Joseph, let me go to you in Montreal on this, because you've not only been a witness to the escalating culture of intolerance in Hungary towards the Roma, but you have been a victim of it too, if I can put it that way. Can you share that with us?
Yeah, you can call me as a victim of extreme movements in Hungary. Not a private person, but a journalist. A couple of years ago, I was discovered in broad daylight while I was attending a human rights march in Budapest. So anyway, I was discovered by the mob. They surrounded me, and they finally beat me up, knocked me to unconscious. Sorry, it's hard to speak about it.
I understand. Why do you think they did that?
Because I was different. I was different from them. I was Jewish, that's how they called me. I was gay, that's how they called me, gay. I was social liberal intellectual, that's how they called me. And I was non-Hungarian, that's how they called me, even though I was and I am Hungarian. But let me suggest you, Steve, something. Let's create a new word. Instead of the well-known word of scapegoat, let me use this scapegoat. This is another ghost of Europe beside extreme movements, fascism and nationalism, which is living and feeling well in Europe, just furthering to Anna Porter's ghost in her book.
Yes. Gina, let me follow up with you on this. I have always been told that to refer to Roma as gypsies is a bad, pejorative thing to do. Is that right?
That's true, Stephen. Thank you for bringing that up, because that's a really important point that I would like to make here, and as well to follow up on what Anna was saying about the school system in Hungary. The word gypsy itself, it comes from a complete misunderstanding of who the Roma people are. After the diaspora began and Roma moved throughout the world, they moved throughout what is now present Afghanistan, moved into Armenia, moved throughout into Greece, moved out into northern Africa, and eventually when they did end up in parts of Europe such as England, they were thought to be Egyptians. Hence the word gypsy, that it evolved from the word Egyptian. It was a case of mistaken identity.
But is it fair to say that Roma all over the world do not like being referred to as gypsies?
Well, that's actually not entirely true to say, because a lot of Roma are not actually educated to their own history. With the youth I work with, the Roma youth I work with in Toronto here, the vast majority of them don't even know what this word Sigan even means, because they refer to each other as Sigan. They don't know the word gypsy, actually. That's more of an English word.
Sigan refers to what?
Sigan refers to gypsies, but it's the European word. They don't use the word, the English word is gypsy.
It's not a PC word anymore, I'm afraid.
You have Sigan, which comes from a root word, a Greek root word, meaning essentially untouchables.
Okay, tell us this. How many Roma do you think? Stand by one second, Joseph. Hang on one second. I just want to, in Toronto, or I guess most of the Roma in Canada are in Toronto. How big is the community here?
Well, there's approximately 2 million Roma in North America, and the vast majority of the community in Canada is located in Toronto. In the last few years alone, we've seen a huge upsurge in the Czech and Hungarian Roma community. But
would it be 100,000 people here?
Yeah, I would say that there could be close to 100,000 in Toronto, but these are not all new people. These are people, Roma have been here for at least 100 years. And this course is actually taught, the Romani diaspora in Canada is taught by Ronald Lee. It was taught at U of T, the Romani diaspora. Okay. And this talks about how the legacy of Roma in Canada. But in 1998, well, the first Roma came, I would say, in 1956 when my family came during the Hungarian Revolution. There was another huge surge in 1998 when the Hungarians first lifted the visa requirement. And this is the third large surge right now, which is, again, the Hungarians visiting.
Right now. Joseph, you wanted to say?
I just wanted to add a quotation from the Roma Macedonian minister, as he said a couple of days or weeks ago, just to make a definition how to call the Romas in Canada and in Europe, in the continent. So he said, we are not an ethnic garbage. It does a lot.
Yes. Randall, help us again with the history. We've heard Gina tell us, started in India, moved through Afghanistan, in points beyond around the world now. During Europe's great wave of nationalism during the 19th century, was there ever a push for a quote-unquote Roma state?
Well, I mean, to be honest, I wouldn't be the person to answer that. In fact, I'm sure our guests here could speak to that issue more eloquently than I could. What I would actually like to do, if I could, is actually shift away from the focus on how awful it is, and I don't agree. I'm very touched by the story I heard from Montreal, and talk about where things work. Because what was said is that nothing works in Europe, and that's not quite true. If we go to Spain, for example, we're seeing a situation in which the Roma community is much more integrated, much more prosperous, in which the situation looks much more positive than it is elsewhere. What's the key to that? Education, education, education.
The Roma have access to education in Spain.
Access to education and a requirement to send their children to school as a condition of receiving benefits. And those two together show quite dramatic increases. Even where things are bad, such as Bulgaria, Roma who have high school education suffer an unemployment rate 10% lower than those with primary education.
Anna.
I just in terms of whether things are worse than they were before, in a previous incarnation when I used to publish books, I commissioned someone to write a book about the Roma. It's called The Rom. And one of the chapters in the book talks about how in Romania, Roma working on farms were not even allowed clothing, and they slept either outdoors in summer and winter or in pigsties. So you know their situation was vastly worse. Although I'm told that the terrible situation in Hungary is wonderful compared to what it's like in Roma villages in Romania. But in terms of education, the Hungarian extreme right has this wonderful proposition that they would take Roma children away from their parents and put them into residential schools. And I wonder if we could give them some advice on that subject.
That sounds very familiar.
Because we've done that.
Well, let me ask Gina about the educational angle, because again, help us with stereotypes here. The stereotype is that Roma families keep their kids out of the mainstream education system because they want to be separate. They don't want to be a part of that. Is that accurate or not?
No, that's not accurate. I would like to bring light to that. I'm an educator myself here in Ontario, and in Hungary, I did spend some time at the European Roma Rights Center. I had the opportunity to actually do some election monitoring in the eastern part of Hungary in a village called Jászladan. And the reason why I went there for election monitoring is because in the previous election, there was a mayor who wanted to enforce segregated education, and the local minority self-government leader, who was the minority self-government would be the Roma people there, the leader did not want this. He even went as far to contact the ombudsman to talk about the fact that he does not want this segregation of Roma children in the schools in Jászladan.
So Roma want to be integrated into the mainstream education system, into mainstream society.
Roma have never wanted not to be involved in society. But involved in a way that respects human rights, irrespective of who they are, right? Up until now, it's just been a complete, basically a closure to the ways that we can integrate into a society. You want to integrate through education. How can you integrate if you're forced to go to segregated or substandard schools?
Let me get Joseph to comment on that as well. Is the whole issue of education, is this your understanding of things as well? That they would want to be integrated but have not been permitted to be?
We should not forget Europe, the Central Eastern European region, is in financial and economic crisis. And the citizens, the population of the region is full of hopes, full of high hopes. The formula is very simple. In that region, in the time of crisis, the state cannot fulfill the people's expectation towards the welfare system any longer. Vast majority of the people thinks that the incapability of the state is generated by its welfare policy towards the so-called second-class people, such as Roma. So why do they get welfare and state funds if they don't work and if they are unemployed and undereducated? So the lack of the sufficient welfare system and the lack of the economic growth further deepen the gap in the society, producing more and more undereducated and more unemployed people. So this is the situation which is a paradise for, as I mentioned, scapegoats in Central Europe.
Yeah, two things. I mean, I'm quite sure the majority of Roma want to send their children to schools. However, if you go visit any West European city where there is a right to education, you will see no end of Roma children begging on the streets. You can't tell me that France or Germany is sending them out there. Again, I'm glad to hear it's a minority, but we can't pretend that's not part of the picture.
What's the motive? What do you think is going on here?
Well, I assume their parents send them out there to beg. I mean, is the French state, the German state? But I don't want to dwell on that issue. I'm glad to say they're a minority. What I want to dwell on is the funds. And to our last speaker, the EU has set aside huge funds for the integration of the Roma. There are billions of euros waiting to be used in Hungary and in Romania for education, for housing, for integration. And this is going to come down to the EU putting sufficient pressure on these countries to do something about the integration of the Roma.
Are you saying these funds are not being used?
Not being taken up at all. In the case of Hungary, there are billions of euros, and these are regional development funds. Hungary's taken up 1% of them.
Gina, you want to comment?
Absolutely. Roma have been integrating for a long, long time. Not all Roma are visible. You can't look at me and tell that I am necessarily a Roma person. There are many Roma in a lot of professions, teachers, doctors, lawyers, professors, journalists. They're out there. They're just not as visible. And they don't always come out and say, I am Roma, because of the stigmatization and negative connotations that come with being associated with the group that you're from, because they're so deeply embedded from generations and generations, right? The problem with school is that sometimes children and families, they haven't received any positive outcomes from the education system. This goes back a very long time. It's not new. And so...
What have you got here? You've got some literature.
I do. This is from the European Roma Rights Center. This is the impact of legislation on policies of school segregation on Romani children. And this is very credible research done by the European Roma Rights Center that has an incredible website. And they talk about what's happened now with the children in light of all of these policies of separating them, putting them into substandard kind of housing facilities, more or less, where they graduate from grade 6, where they don't even know how to write their own names half the time. They're still illiterate. And some of the statistics I could add to you to go with that, less than half of Roma children actually get past grade 6. Less than 2% actually get past high school, and less than 1% actually get to go on to post-secondary education.
Maybe I could ask you to follow up on that question I tried earlier with Randall, which is, was there an attempt to create a Roma homeland at some point in the 19th century?
There has never been an attempt to create a Roma homeland. Roma themselves don't even really have not really known where they're from. It's somehow, you know, they've been kept in this kind of capsulized way in society where they haven't really been allowed access to much education.
Is there a Roma language?
There is a Romani language. There's a Romani language. There's actually a Roma flag. This is the Roma flag right here. These are all new within the last 3 decades.
Hold it higher up.
This is the Roma flag. This really represents the sky. This represents the earth, the green, and the wheel is actually the same wheel that you'll find in the middle of the Indian flag, which is a 16-spoke chakra representing progress and movement. There is a Romani national anthem now. There's a Romani rights movement that's been gaining pace in the last few decades. There's recognition of there is a people that are Roma people. There's acknowledgement that there's human rights abuses, and there's more than just segregated education. There's coercive sterilization. There's forced evictions. There's no access to health care, no access to social services.
Stand by. Anna Porter.
I just want to come back to the amounts of money, and you mentioned, I mean, as far as I could tell, and I was asking people the amount of money from the EU's 275 million, which is significant, and a lot of it hasn't been taken up, but it requires applications by Roma, and very often they don't have the education to be able to fill out large forms to apply. Now, this would seem to me to be something that someone could do, just to help them fill out forms. I was hugely moved to help Mr. Horvath with his forms, because he had managed to get a little bit of, this is the man who drove me to the village where the 65-year-old boy had been murdered the week before. And he had applied for some money, and he had not filled out all the forms and everything, and so he had given up, and he was now outside of the program. And this is a man who's very engaged with trying to help Roma right across Canada where they need help. But I'm curious about the 150 million of Open Society funding from George Soros and how it's being used. Now, I don't know who to look at. Can I look at you?
Does anybody know? Is there any uptake on that?
I certainly know there's a large portion of funding from the Open Society Institute and George Soros goes to fund the European Roma Rights Center and goes to fund a lot of projects in Europe for the Roma. There's been a decade of Roma inclusion happening from 2005 to 2015. It's supposed to be the decade of Roma inclusion in Europe.
So in some respects, things are getting better, but in France, they're getting worse.
Well, I'd like to say that there's no compliance and enforcement of policies protecting human rights. So on the macro level, Hungary, for example, has signed on to all of the human rights policies that would ensure education and access to everything else that would protect the rights of Roma.
Okay,
but
Randall,
on the ground level, there's no compliance whatsoever.
Randall?
Yeah, I mean, this brings us back to the issue of the funds. I mean, it's a slightly technical issue. There's money for which individual Roma have to apply, but the states can apply for European regional funds and European social funds and use that money for Roma. So it is there. To the broader point, I want to be clear, there's absolutely no question that there's a terrible history of discrimination, well documented in all the publications that you talk about. But it's also a hard fact that, and I've done enough work on comparative diaspora to see this, that if a community wants to succeed, it's also going to have to take ownership over its own success. And it's not helpful to simply say victim, 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 victim. What we need to do is say, how can we move forward on this? How can we put the right pressure on the states, and in some cases on that minority of the Roma population themselves? And that's how we'll move this forward.
Let me get Joseph in here. Do you think the Roma play the victim card too often, Joseph?
I would offer a bigger view of the conflict and the situation in Europe. For example, in Hungary, lately the Neo-fascist party just introduced a bill to round up the Romas into internment camps. They called it public order protection camp. And Steve, let me tell you, I wasn't brave enough to call a spade, but one of Canadian dailies called it and named it ghettos. So they wanted to introduce a curfew after 10 p.m. and the Roma would need a special permission to leave the ghetto even in broad daylight in Hungary. So we have to face the fact how historically recycled phenomena was reborn again in Europe. So the motion of ghettos in Hungary did not pass the floor. It's a good news, absolutely a good news. But the bad news is, however, that the party's television ads for the latest municipal elections were about parasites and gypsies telling down with parasites. And the Hungarian public service television and radio refused to broadcast it for its racist message. But that's the bad news. The Supreme Court of Hungary ordered and forced the media to broadcast this. Yes, Steve, that's the ghost has overcome the common sense.
Gina, a follow-up?
Yes, just to follow up on that, and what Randall also mentioned, yes, the community does need support and change from within. Roma, sometimes they have been subjected to a lot of treatment that they don't deserve, but at the same time, Roma do have to stand up and start to unite together and realize that we are actually one people at one point and that we have to come together to be stronger. And one of the things that we're doing in Toronto is we've started a Parkdale Youth Club, and these are all, it's a Roma student club, in fact, and it's all Roma students that are from Hungary and the Czech Republic, all who have had faced the Magyar Garda in certain Hungarian towns that they come from in Eastern Europe. Many of them have scars to show that they've had encounters where, you know, they can't even leave the home after certain times at night. And what we're doing is starting to educate them. We're starting to educate them about their past, their culture, their history. We're starting to get them to go to school.
Okay, forgive me, Gina, we've got just a few minutes left. Anna Porter, you wanted to say.
I really have a question. It's a question for Canadians and for all of us around this table and Joseph in Montreal. What should our government do about the great upsurge of Roma refugee claimants?
This is a tough issue
it's a very tough issue.
Because the Roma come from countries which we don't recognize as oppressing people, and therefore we don't give them refugee status when they come here. You got any thoughts about what we should do about this, Randall?
Well, this is a difficult one. I mean, I think if we think they're genuine refugees and they're suffering persecution, then clearly they should be admitted. That's one policy. The second is not to admit them on the grounds that you've mentioned, but to make much more of why we're not admitting them and bring as much international pressure as possible on Hungary and the Czech Republic.
Okay, Gina.
Just a quick comment, please. The acceptance rate for Hungarian and Czech Roma refugees last year was upwards of 85%.
Acceptance of what?
Of the Czech and Hungarian Roma refugee claimants that have come here to Toronto. Okay. The present acceptance rate is now 1%. And this is in light of remarks that were made by Minister Jason Kenney claiming that the Roma refugee claimants were actually bogus and they're not escaping any persecution in Europe and they're really only here as economic refugees. So it completely annihilated any truth to the fact that there is a real problem that exists, and you know, focusing on what's happening in France right now, I don't really see a lot of recognition and focus to the root causes of these problems. So we have less than 1% acceptance, and I don't see that the problems in Europe have gone away.
Okay,
why
tell me this,
from 80% to 1?
See the one finger she's holding up? That means we got a minute left.
Okay, sorry.
And I need 30 seconds to say thank you to everybody, so you got 30 seconds for
Thank
this, Gina. The Council of Europe,
yes.
47 nations, they're meeting on the 20th of October. This is an organization that promotes human rights. They're going to take up this issue. What do you want them to do?
I want them to really try to make these countries comply. The Eastern European countries where the majority of Roma are from right now and that are leaving from these countries because the conditions they face over there, they need to comply to the human rights standards and agreements that they had agreed upon to become part of the European Union to begin with.
That was beautifully done. Thank you very much. Can I thank, out of town in our Montreal studio, Jozef Orosz, the Hungarian journalist. It's good to have you on the line. Thank you for joining us from Montreal, Jozef.
Thank you.
Anna Porter, The Ghosts of Europe is her latest book. Anna, great to have you here in our studio. Randall Hansen from the University of Toronto, good to see you again. Gina Chani, the chair of the Roma Community Center here in Toronto. Thank you for coming to participate in our program tonight as well.